Welcome to the Rural Research Symposium, Housing Affordability, Rural Rental Markets session. All lines are in listen-only mode. This session is being recorded and will be available to watch on demand after we've concluded. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and your question will be answered by a speaker or a subject matter expert. You will also find links to the speakers' bios and the presentation deck there as well. Lastly, if you have any technical issues, please use the Q&A box and someone will assist you. With that, I will turn it over to our Vice President of Multifamily Research and Modeling, Steve Guggenmos. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to this session on housing affordability in rural rental markets. We have really a fantastic session today, and I think this is really important. I've been participating in this for 3 or 4 years, and the opportunity to hone in and dig deep on issues related to affordability is really important. And that's especially true, I think, whether I look back 3 years or look back 1 year and think about housing affordability, that it has only become a bigger and bigger issue. And I think we all know that, whether it's in our day-to-day as people who care about this, or even listening to the news. And I would say that 3 or 4 years ago, most of us weren't hearing about these issues at all in the day-to-day media. So today we get a chance to look at it in terms of rural housing, and we have absolutely fantastic content where we're going to be able to look into it from a few different perspectives. And to do that, we have Sara Hoffmann, my colleague, who's a director of multifamily research here at Freddie Mac, as well as Sara Latham, who's a senior research analyst at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, as well as Andew Jakabovics, who's Vice President of Policy Development at Enterprise Community Partners. And I just want to welcome everybody again to this session and look forward to the content, and look forward to circling back and asking some questions at the end. But now I'll turn it over to you, Sara.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for having me. I'm excited to discuss some new research our team's been doing to help really understand high opportunity areas. But first, maybe let's start with just kind of understanding what the goal of high opportunity areas is and why we're trying to capture those areas, and why that's important to us here at Freddie Mac. So high opportunity areas are, their goal is to try to provide access for the residents to amenities, or they have attributes that can help increase the residents' economic or social mobility. Which pretty much means that the individual or family has the ability to materially increase their income during the lifetime through better education, lower incarceration rates, a bunch of different things that just really help identify areas that provide that opportunity to the residents. As part of our mission at Freddie, we plan to help support these areas, especially with affordable rental housing there. Now, currently, these areas are defined through a few different ways, including HUD's difficult to develop areas, which has a specified poverty rate cap, as well as through a state's local qualified allocation plan, or QAP. Not every state has enough or has QAPs detailed enough to be able to identify areas that make it into our list of high opportunity areas, but a good handful of them do. But so with the current methodology in place, the current definition of high opportunity areas is an effective way to measure opportunity in certain areas. In the past here at Freddie Mac, we've done a lot of extensive research to try to understand these areas. We've done work on just what the different attributes are in the areas, the availability of affordable rental housing there. We even looked at some case studies of properties we funded in those areas. But here, this research that we're working on now kind of takes it a step further to really enhance the industry's understanding and knowledge to identify these areas. And especially when we think of it for renters. As we've all heard, the American dream of owning a home with the idea of building home equity. But for renters, that's a little bit of a different picture. And if we can really focus on affordable housing in areas where renters can build economic or social equity, then you kind of get the idea that they have that opportunity equity available to renters. So we took the look at trying to coming up with a way of measuring opportunity using two metrics, the Opportunity Atlas and Location Score. So starting with Opportunity Atlas, this is a very well-known measurement that was started with Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren from Harvard University, along with John Friedman from Brown University, among other census researchers, to provide identifying at different areas the expected outcome of a child's earnings in adulthood given the parent's income percentile. So in essence, it's really trying to measure intergenerational opportunity. So the opportunity of children when they grow up in a certain area to be able to have higher income in adulthood. This method looks at different percentiles of the parent's income. For our purpose, we use the 25th percentile. And then the second one we look at is the location score. Now, this is a model that was developed here at Freddie Mac in the multifamily research and modeling team. It was a method to rate the quality of locations at the different census tracts. And this provides information that's consistent evaluation of comparison of location qualities across different geographic areas. Whenever we kind of think of how the quality in certain areas is, it can be a bias based on perspective, but this kind of gives us that, that ground to be able to do based on 5 key factors, be able to measure all areas across the country. And this captures things from economic factors, demographics, transportation access, the rental markets, and the labor market conditions. So this uses some machine learning algorithms with all of these factors, and it helps kind of quantify each of those contributions to help create that score. So what we start with is the current framework of high opportunity areas. We know it's an effective way of measuring areas that have opportunity to its residents. And so with the current defined high opportunity areas, we then match each area at the census tract with both of these scores. And starting with the Opportunity Atlas score, what we do is we take between the high opportunity areas and the non-high opportunity areas, we map out the density curve that you see here for all of the census tracts. The blue line represents the currently defined high opportunity areas, whereas the yellow is those areas not designated as high opportunity. And intuitively, what you see is the blue lines to the right of the yellow line, or that median where you see that dotted line is a bit higher at 48 for high opportunity areas versus 41 for non-high opportunity areas. And this is intuitive given that the current definition of high opportunity areas, we would expect that they have slightly higher scores given that they are designated or designed to hit areas that have that higher opportunity already based on the current definition of the difficult to develop areas or states' QAP plans identifying them. But what we do see here is that that little bit of that yellow curve that overlays or is to the right of the median high opportunity area score. So the idea here is that those non-high opportunity areas have Opportunity Atlas scores that are equal to or greater than the median score for high opportunity areas and would exhibit some of those same characteristics of high opportunity areas. We do the same with the location score. We see very similar results here. The curve distribution is a little bit more spread out. The median high opportunity location score is a bit higher at 57 compared to the non-high opportunity areas at 45. But similar density curve patterns where you see a little bit of those non-high opportunity areas, that shaded region, that have location scores equal to or greater than the median score for the high opportunity areas. So when we combine these together, that actually gives us an opportunity matrix where we can identify both those with location and opportunity scores that are greater to or equal than the median for that set of population where we use the currently defined high opportunity areas. And that box, that red box, and what we label here is the opportunity quadrant, really shows is those areas that have scores above the median threshold that we use, being the current defined high opportunity areas. From this, you can see that the majority of the blue dots, which represent those high opportunity areas, are concentrated in that opportunity quadrant. Again, to our intuition that these scores are identifying some of those attributes that we know are captured in currently defined high opportunity areas. So we see a lot of those areas fall into that quadrant, but you still see some yellow areas or non-high opportunity areas that are picked up there. And what we learned about with this approach is a lot of those areas that are non-high opportunity areas are very close to the high opportunity areas. Our intuition is what we want to kind of think a little bit more broadly about is high opportunity areas a binary, you're in it or you're not in it? We want to think of it more on a spectrum-based approach. So the idea being that just because you're right outside of an area, there's argument to believe that there's some opportunity to its residents there, even if it's not directly inside an area designated as high opportunity. So with this approach, we can see where those non-high opportunity areas are and their proximity. And we found that close to about 50% of them or so are adjacent to a high opportunity area. So meaning that their census tract borders with an area already defined as high opportunity. And those that aren't, the median distance is about 1 mile. So they're all very close into what areas are already kind of designated as higher opportunity. And then what this approach also provides us is the ability to kind of think of it on that spectrum approach. Like this opportunity quadrant might identify some areas that have those scores that are above the median thresholds. But if you move those thresholds, 1 or 2, then you start seeing other areas come in. And that goes again with our approach of saying, is there a spectrum of high opportunity? And even if you're not exactly matching, say, a score criteria that this method is introducing, it opens up the ability to kind of think about what opportunity can be in some of those areas that are just right outside the score or just right outside those thresholds. So what we found with this approach is 3,148 census tracts that are not identified as high opportunity, but they have scores that are equal to or above the median threshold scores we used in this approach. And as mentioned, these areas exhibit similar characteristics as high opportunity areas, giving their scores. But when we kind of looked a little bit deeper and broke this down by different tract types, rural versus urban, we do see that there is a lower concentration of rural in this method. So about 2% are rural tracts versus 98% that are urban. When we look at the full population of high opportunity areas, that concentration is much different. About 16% are rural versus 84% that are urban. So one of the shortcomings is that the method didn't really help identify different areas among these different breakouts of the tract, or different types of rural versus urban areas. But what's great about this method is, again, that dynamic ability to kind of change those thresholds. We then went ahead and moved it to the thresholds for urban or rural areas only. So to really focus in on the rural population, we did the same methodology, but instead of the full census tracts, we just went to the rural defined census tracts. You can see that on the left is the Opportunity Atlas score. Those distribution curves are actually very similar to one another. So you can see that there's really not much sensitivity on the Opportunity Atlas score for rural areas, that you have high opportunity areas and the rural and the non-high opportunity areas in rural, very similar scores. But we do see a little bit more of a difference in the location score. And this is expected, given that the location score does pick up a lot of things such as that would really be highlighted in densely urban areas between access to transportation, rental market conditions, labor market. So that's where we see a little bit of that sensitivity is more on the location score side than we would have on the Opportunity Atlas score side. But when we reset these thresholds and kind of recompute for that opportunity quadrant, it does pick up many more rural census tracts that are non-high opportunity areas, but have a median score above or equal to the score for high opportunity areas. And so lastly, we just kind of took 2 case studies. We looked at by states where these areas are. So the top 5 states that have added tracks that got picked up in this are Minnesota, California, which are shown here on the screen, along with then Texas, Pennsylvania, and Iowa. And what we're showing here is all rural census tracts. So these are not all census tracts, but just the rural ones. Blue indicates ones that are currently defined high opportunity areas. And then the red indicate ones that kind of show up in that opportunity quadrant. The different shades of red indicate whether it's adjacent to or not adjacent to a high opportunity area. So again, if the census tract border touches up with a currently defined high opportunity area. So we can definitely see a little bit difference in how they're played out with, in Minnesota, they're a little bit more spread out. Not as many are adjacent to currently defined high opportunity areas. Whereas in California, you see a little bit of a different trend where we do see the more of them are adjacent to other high opportunity areas. So this is a new approach, a new research that we're working on that really does help us dive in and try to understand a little bit more of what makes up high opportunity areas. Next, I'm going to turn over to my colleague Sara, who's going to take a little bit deeper dive into transportation and rural housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. Like Sara said, my name is Sara Latham. I'm with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and I'm going to talk to you today about kind of the intersection of costs between housing and transportation. Before I get much farther, I have to say that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of myself. They do not reflect an official position of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. With that out of the way, I did want to give a little bit of an overview of the Federal Reserve System. So the Federal Reserve System consists of the Board of Governors, which is located in Washington, D.C., and 12 regional banks, which are located across the United States. I work for the 5th District Bank, which we refer to as the Richmond Fed. In addition to its dual mandate of stabilizing prices and maximizing employment, the Fed also has a community development mandate. The community development mandate requires banks across the Federal Reserve System to promote economic growth and financial stability in low and moderate income communities by partnering with intermediaries, convening stakeholders, and conducting research, to include the research I'm about to share with you. Each Federal Reserve Bank includes dedicated staff to tracking emerging economic issues affecting their communities. And the Richmond Fed has a special focus on small towns and rural areas, which is one of the things that brought me to this research question. So for this research, I have used the USDA's 2013 Rural Urban Continuum Codes to classify counties as either urban or rural. Counties with an RUCC of 3 through 9 are considered rural, and those with an RUCC of 1 or 2 are considered urban. For those of you familiar with the RUCC codes, you may notice the RUCC 3 is actually considered metro. I've included them in my rural definition in this research in order to capture small towns that would have otherwise been considered urban. So why are we looking at housing and transportation together? For starters, housing and transportation are inextricably linked, since housing choice factors in location. Where housing is located affects how close residents are to resources and employment opportunities, and thus how much they will spend on transportation. In theory, housing and transportation costs are inversely related, meaning that the more a household spends on housing, the less they're going to spend on transportation. This is a good place to point out that where a household chooses to live is not necessarily a problem. A person's preference for living in a rural area will likely take transportation constraints into consideration. In addition to being related expenses, we also see that housing and transportation are the 2 largest recurring household expenditures, according to the BLS's Consumer Expenditure Survey. And also considering transportation expenses in the context of housing is especially important in rural communities because, as I'm about to show you, households tend to spend more on transportation than they do on housing. I also want to kind of level set and introduce 2 concepts: what is meant by affordable and what is meant by the typical household. So in the housing space, as many of you know, housing is considered affordable if it amounts to less than 30% of a household's income, or 30% or less. According to the Center for Neighborhood Technology, when we take housing and transportation expenses together, the two should cost no more than 45% of a household's gross income. Next, you'll also hear me use the term typical household throughout this presentation. When I use that, the typical household refers to a household earning the regional area median income. So let's dig into the data and see what housing and transportation expenses look like in rural spaces at a national level. So nationally, the typical household tends to spend more on housing and slightly less on transportation than the typical rural household if we're just looking at total amount expended. But the typical rural household also spends a larger share of their income on transportation when we look at share. Both the typical urban household and typical rural household spend less than 30% of their income on housing, meeting the housing affordability threshold. But notably, the typical rural household spends about 30% of their income on transportation, compared to only 22% for the typical urban household. It's worth noting here that mortgages and rent payments tend to be relatively stable from month to month, whereas transportation costs can fluctuate depending on the high cost of energy. In this context, the typical rural household is not only subject to higher costs relative to income, but also greater budgetary uncertainty from month to month. This chart breaks out housing and transportation costs of share of income by rurality and also by census regions. And there are a few takeaways that I want to point out from this admittedly complicated chart. First, housing costs less than 30% for the typical household in both urban and rural parts of the South and Midwest. Housing accounts for larger shares of the typical household's budget in the West and the Northeast. Transportation costs are highest in the South when we compare urban areas to urban areas and rural areas to rural areas. Combined housing and transportation costs are also consistently greater in rural areas throughout all 4 census regions. And last, combined costs of housing and transportation are greatest in the rural South and the rural West. So this map shows how much the typical household spends on housing plus transportation as a share of their income by county across the United States. In very few rural counties does the cost of housing fall below the 45% threshold. In most rural counties, the typical household spends between 45 and 75% of their income on these two expenses. And we see pockets of relatively high costs, so greater than 60% of income for the typical household being spent on housing and transportation in the South and parts of the West. But how much of this is housing and how much of it's transportation? So as mentioned before, I will now demonstrate that rural household spends more on transportation than for housing. Sorry for spoiling the surprise for everyone. This chart shows the share of households that spent more on housing, more on transportation, or about the same on both expenses. Nationwide, about 63% of rural households spend more on transportation versus only 7% of urban households. And this map shows whether the typical household spends more on housing, which is in green, or housing, which is in purple, transportation, which is in green, or about the same amount on both expenses, which is white. Urban counties are excluded from this analysis and are grayed out in this map. The typical household spends more on transportation in most rural counties. The exceptions where housing is more costly are clustered in the Mid-Atlantic region, around the Rockies, and along the West Coast. So first off, while I can't speak to causality, these factors, whether the county is in a metro county or a metro adjacent county, residential density, employment density, and road network density are some of the factors that we could see as being reasons why transportation costs would be relatively high in some rural areas. Rural counties where the typical household spends more on transportation are less likely to be considered a metro area or metro adjacent. They have lower residential, employment, and road network density, although road network density is similar in order of magnitude across these two groups of counties. Taken together, it makes sense that transportation would be more costly in areas where the typical household spends more on transportation than on housing. So their homes are farther apart, as are places of employment, to include community resources that employ people, such as grocery stores or healthcare establishments. Because road networks are less dense, they will have fewer options of which route to take, preventing them from optimizing their route to conserve time and fuel. And being from the Fed, my interest is in how these findings affect the population's economic well-being. High transportation costs may itself be a barrier to employment or may be an indicator of other barriers to employment, either of which would affect residents' earning potential. This slide also includes a column for urban county statistics as a point of comparison. And what we see are differences in economic outcomes between the two rural groups. Counties in which transportation costs more than housing have lower labor force participation rates, employment to population ratios, and median household incomes. Unemployment rates are about the same across the two rural groups, meaning those who are in the labor force are equally likely to be employed. These may be the result of higher transportation costs, but they could also be the result of an endogenous factor. For example, we've just seen that counties where transportation costs more than housing have lower employment density. It's possible that the observed lower labor force participation could be due to a lack of nearby employment opportunities rather than transportation expenses in and of themselves. So I want to close by just sharing a few policy ideas from rural parts of the 5th District. These examples are intended to be a source of inspiration for changes that can be made while preserving the character of rural places. So while often considered a solution for urban areas, developing or optimizing public transit system is a viable way to reduce residents' transportation expenses in rural areas as well. This solution is especially important for seniors and persons with disabilities. In the 5th District, seniors and persons with disabilities make up a larger share of the population in rural areas than they do in urban areas. Moreover, about 7% of households in both urban and rural areas in the 5th District do not have access to a personal vehicle. There are two types of public transportation systems: fixed route systems, which follow a given route on a set schedule, and on-demand systems. The type of public transportation system is going to depend on how the program is funded, community density, and community preferences. Country Roads Transit is an example of a hybrid public transit system from the 5th District. Country Roads Transit has served both Randolph and Upshur counties in West Virginia since 2006, and it provides both fixed routes and special pickups and drop-offs upon request. In addition to revenue from rider fares, Country Roads Transit has been financially supported from grant funding and private and nonprofit contributions. Investing in placemaking refers to a wide array of policy solutions, but here I'm going to share two examples that have the potential to help reduce transportation expenses in rural communities. Revitalizing Main Street corridors in small towns is one way to make rural communities and small towns more pedestrian-friendly, thus reducing the amount of time residents and visitors spend in their car between destinations. One approach is to renovate underutilized commercial buildings and put them back to work. In Harrisonburg, Virginia, designer and entrepreneur Kristen Moore led the redevelopment of an unused tire shop and garage space built in the 1940s. She used both federal and state historic tax credits to convert the building into an award-winning mixed-use space. The building renovation has enhanced foot traffic in the area, improved success of nearby restaurants, and been a catalyst for other adaptive reuse projects in the neighborhood. Redeveloping car-oriented streets to be pedestrian-oriented is especially beneficial in small towns that are bisected by highways. Hillsborough, Virginia is one such community. Recently, Hillsborough updated the stretch of State Route 9 that serves as the town's main street. Upon entering Hillsborough, drivers are now encouraged to slow down by roundabouts at either end of the town and narrowed lanes within the towns. As a result of the project, residents are more likely to walk than to drive short distances within town and have a greater sense of safety and community connectivity. In addition, residents have benefited from water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure upgrades that were implemented simultaneously. Lastly, having access to broadband reduces the number of trips for rural households. For example, a common example is improved access to broadband would allow rural residents to visit their doctor's offices over telehealth visits, reducing the need to drive to doctor's offices or hospitals to receive medical care. Broadband would also further expand rural residents' access to amenities and economic opportunities not available in their local communities, such as online education or remote work. Virginia has passed legislation to permit utilities to recover costs associated with extending fiber optic cables into rural communities. This supported Dominion Energy's rural broadband program, in which Dominion Energy will lay fiber optic cable lines connecting urban to rural communities. They are partnering with local internet service providers to then connect rural households to the newly available fiber lines. Local governments can also facilitate the expansion of broadband to their residents by laying fiber conduits. Hillsborough, Virginia's Route 9 streetscape improvements did just that, which allowed the town to attract an internet service provider using ARPA funding to cover the cost of running cable through the town and to each individual residence. The town then provided limited time grants to the company in order to cover the initial installation cost for individual households to connect to the fiber network. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Jakabovics, who's going to talk about rural multifamily housing and Section 515 housing.
Great. Thank you, Sara. So I'm going to be talking about preserving rural affordable rentals, particularly looking at the Section 515 program, and particularly looking at the question about ownership and management and their role in the future of the affordability of these properties. And this is work that I've been doing with colleagues at Georgia Tech, Brian Ann, Anthony Orlando, who's a Cal Poly Pomona, and Sieva Redyansky at Occidental College. So I wanted to acknowledge their support for this work and their engagement throughout. So rural subsidized rental housing is basically provided through the Section 515 program, and it really serves a need in the communities that have them. About 40% of the 5 million rural renters are in fact low income, and these properties themselves are a scarce resource in those communities and account for about 6.5% of the rural rental units. It's also spread out throughout the entire country. It's been estimated by the Housing Assistance Council that about 87% of counties in the United States have at least one property built using mortgages under the Section 515 program. And so it fits into a broader policy and program discussions that we're having about rural needs and around preservation more broadly for affordable housing, given that the Section 515 mortgage program has basically been relatively dormant of late, and so many of these mortgages that were issued a long time ago are starting to get paid off or have the option for prepayment, which also leads to exit from the program, and with it the risk of lost affordability. And we'll spend a lot of time later in the presentation talking about those factors. And one of the reasons why we chose to study this is that in fact there's some fairly good data about the program itself, and it's an area that's understudied and generally underappreciated in terms of its role for providing affordable rental housing in communities with great needs. So the USDA Section 515 program is in fact the largest rural subsidized rental program, and it incorporates currently about 15,000 properties with about almost 500,000 units, about 450,000 units. And the tenant incomes are incredibly low. The average tenant income is under $14,000 in the program. And many of these tenants, about 4 out of every 5 tenant, is also on rental assistance, many of which use the Section 521 voucher program, which is directly linked to the Section 515 mortgage program, as well as housing choice vouchers in other communities. A very important program that also supports rural rental housing, and we should acknowledge, is the low-income housing tax credit, which serves both urban and rural areas, and it's the second largest source of subsidized affordable rental housing in rural areas, with about half the scale of the USDA 515 program, about 272,000 units, and has some overlap with the Section 515 program. And so there is some kind of overlapping requirements, overlapping opportunities. In fact, some state QAPs, the qualified allocation plans, which drive the applications to get the low-income housing tax credit in many states, have rural set aside. So the part of the money that flows to the state through the housing credit and is made available to developers of multifamily affordable housing, there are special set-asides that are particularly targeted towards rural geographies, in addition to other types of set-asides that often exist within the QAP programs. So looking at the map of 515 properties that are in existence currently, we've estimated, or rather the Housing Assistance Council, we've borrowed their map, which is an excellent map, has estimated the exit date based on the loan maturity of the underlying Section 515 properties. And so you can see both the concentration of properties and distribution throughout the country, and then the estimated exit date based on loan maturity. The darkest red are the ones most likely to exit soonest, extending all the way out through the middle of this century in the lightest colors down, so red, orange, blue, and gray. So the gray indicates the properties that have the longest time remaining within the program, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. So the important thing to recognize, and this is really kind of the heart of getting to the heart of the research, is the point is that the program exit, leaving the 515 program, doesn't always mean lost affordability, but it does depend on many factors. And some of these factors include the strength of the market where the properties are located. So weak markets are going to have different exit velocities and exit opportunities versus those properties in stronger markets. The foreclosure risk is very real, and when properties are foreclosed upon, the mortgage obviously is extinguished at that point, and so the program is also exited. We just heard from Sara about the importance of access to transit, and so that also potentially has implications for the strength of the market and the program exit risk, and then also the availability or existence of other post-subsidy affordability factors, including additional public resources for recapitalization. And then another important factor that we're going to spend some time examining is the role of ownership, how properties owned by nonprofits change the exit propensity as opposed to for-profit ownership. So with that, one more slide on just the current state of the program. So using the National Housing Preservation Database, which is a terrific resource if folks are not familiar with it, we look at the universe of properties that existed within the program or are currently active within the program, and about 84% of the properties that had been in the program remain in the program, and about 16% have exited over time. We've also used data from the USDA. They make current data available on their website, as well as using Decennial Census and American Community Survey data for some of the demographic data that we use in our analysis. So with that, I'm going to turn to our analysis of the propensity for exit from the Section 515 program and trying to identify the characteristics that have the strongest correlation with exit. So the characteristics we analyzed fall into three broad buckets. There are property level characteristics, such as the number of units in the property, the age of the property, the presence of other subsidies, including the low-income housing tax credit primarily, as well as other subsidy programs that may be state or local, and then the location in terms of whether these properties fall within rural or urban areas. Even though this is characteristically a rural program, boundaries have changed over time, as well as the growth of metro areas. So just that is not a fixed definition, as we also heard Sara talk about the rural continuum, but we've used kind of a stricter definition of rural versus urban, also with only two categories. We've also looked at owner and property manager characteristics, which I think is an important component in understanding the exit risk. So we look at the type of manager and the type of owner, whether the owner themselves are the manager, the number of properties under management or under ownership by that owner or manager, and then the share of 515s as part of the overall size of the county rental stock, the corporate structure of the owner, and the corporate structure of the manager. And then looking at the local market characteristics at the county level, we looked at factors including population density and median incomes, fair market rents as a proxy for the strength or weakness of the local rental market, renter cost burdens and severe renter cost burdens, poverty rates, public assistance, renter share, vacancy rates, labor force participation, unemployment, and a few other factors, including race and ethnicity. So with that, looking at just overall the level of the role of management companies, this is some data that we've compiled, that in about 9% of cases, the owners themselves manage their properties, but in most cases, properties are managed by third parties. And the level of concentration, all the way on the right side of the chart, you can see the concentration if you look at management across the entirety of the nation. But within states, the concentration, this is using a Herfindahl index, which is a typical measure of concentration, you can see that it ranges at Nevada at the high end of concentration, all the way out to places like Texas, North Dakota, and Nebraska all the way up on the right side of the distribution. So there's a broad range, but in a number of counties, in a number of states across the country, the levels of concentration are fairly significant, whether you're looking at management at the property level or whether you're looking at the scale of units that they control. And again, the ownership levels of concentration are far less concentrated, so much more distributed across ownership. But there is a question as to whether if an owner chooses to exit, whether the manager is able to find someone else to take over the property. And conversely, if a management company chooses to exit, the implications for a wide number of owners may in fact be important to understand the risk to the continuation persistence of the properties within the program. One of the things that we found in just looking at the raw data is that for-profit and profit-motivated entities have a fairly small share of active properties or active units, 10% of active properties, but account for 57% of the exits, similar numbers in terms of the unit counts, compared to limited profits, which account for almost half of all active properties, or about 44% of all active units. These are limited profits. These are for-profit entities that have an upper bound on their allowed returns. So they are profit motivated, but there is an upper bound, and that obviously changes the economics of their decision making in terms of remaining in the program or potentially exiting. And then nonprofits account for about a fifth, a little less than a fifth of all active properties. Important to note that both limited profit and nonprofit have fairly low shares of exits. So compared to the almost 60% of exits that are observed coming from for-profit or profit-motivated ownership, only about 10%, 11% of the limited profit properties have exited the program to date. So we built a statistical model that uses sort of a standard probit format with explanatory variables being the property characteristics, the owner and management characteristics, and the local market characteristics, as I've described. And basically, it's set up so that it's a dependent variable of 1 if the property is exited the program, or 0 if the property remains in the program. And so we look at the marginal effects, the impact of a small change in explanatory variable on the probability of a property exiting the program to date. And so we looked at the property characteristics. We find that size is an important indicator, and as properties are larger, they're less likely to exit. So a 10-unit change in the property size decreases exit probability by about 1%. Conversely, age of the property, the older the property, the more likely it is to exit. So a property that's 10 years older has a 4% higher likelihood of exiting the program. That's both likely a function of the age of the property being a property that also got its mortgage a longer time ago, and so the mortgage may have been paid off, and if the mortgage is paid off, then they're no longer in the program. But it also may mean that it may have more deferred maintenance and other operating challenges, and so there may also be a higher likelihood of foreclosure as a source of exit, which is a non-trivial source of program exit over time that we've seen. And there's some good research by Hack, again, that's looked at that particular question. And then the availability of the presence of an extra subsidy cuts the exit probability by 6%. So that's an important way in which these properties can remain affordable and remain in the program for the long term, is if there's another source beyond just the 515 mortgage. And not statistically significant is geographic considerations in terms of whether the property is located in an urban or rural area. Shifting to owner characteristics, the key points here are that any kind of nonprofit or limited profit ownership reduces exit probabilities by 30 to 40% compared to a pure for-profit. Manager type is less important, and whether the owner is a manager slightly increases the exit probability, but not a tremendous amount, certainly not compared to the magnitude of impact that the type of ownership of the property has on the exit probabilities. But we do note that also when Section 515 properties make up a larger share of all rental units, the probability of any particular property exiting does rise over time. So that's, I think, an important indicator of places to start focusing on in terms of preservation strategies, and where the risk is greatest is going to be in the places where the concentrations of these properties are higher, and particularly being mindful of the willingness or ability of the for-profit ownership to remain in the properties over the long term. Not particularly significant, actually, is the corporate structure of the ownership. So it's really much more about a question of whether the ownership are in fact for-profit versus limited profit or nonprofit. And we also find that manager corporate structure does not make an impact. So it's less important exactly how the owners and managers are structured, but really whether they are for-profit or not. And then lastly, obviously, the geography and the local market characteristics do have important impacts. The important thing to focus on is really the rightmost column in each of these two tables, really looking at the pre-period census data. So when we say the pre-period census data, this is the census in the period before the property exited. So anything that exited in the teens is going to be using the 2010 data. And then the marginal change column is using current data. Perhaps not surprisingly, the share of residents who live in poverty is an important criterion. 68% reduced likelihood of exit relative to the medians, I think is sort of an important indicator that where there's persistent need, it likely means that the rental market for purely market rate properties is not particularly strong, and so the availability of rentals that are affordable through the program is going to be important for the ongoing affordability for those renters, and so the likelihood of the properties trying to remain in the program or the opportunities to exit the program, I should say, are far reduced. The unemployment rate and labor force participation rates have very, very large magnitudes, but those are also much more volatile, and so I think we can kind of be mindful of some of those and understand whether the unemployment labor force participation rates have been elevated over long periods of time, which might lead to either, if there's an elevated unemployment rate, ongoing weakness, and so that might also lead to financial challenges for certain properties. So I think it's important to be mindful that those do have large impacts, but they are also going to be a little bit more volatile over time. There's definitely some regional distinctions, with the Plains region being most likely to exit. We use the Southeast as the base case. And then college attainment share. So higher educational achievement often correlates with higher incomes, which is another indicator that the rental market outside of the subsidized space may be more robust and therefore may create more opportunities, particularly for for-profit owners, to seek a program exit either at the end of the mortgage period or to prepay the mortgage if that's available to them. So with that, thank you, and I will turn it over to Steve to facilitate the Q&A.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Andrew. That was really fascinating, as were all the presentations, and a ton. I mean, absolutely a great deep dive across multiple topics. I really appreciate how kind of Sara started things off, and we got to learn, digging deep, learn not only about affordability but opportunity, and oftentimes when we at Freddie Mac, there's often the leaning and lots of discussion of home ownership and how that can build home equity. And I think by layering in the idea of building equity or building opportunity for the next generation into our thinking, that can also benefit renters and all households. But I think that's really fantastic. And thinking about how we might overlay that with the rental market in affordable and in rural areas is really fantastic. And being able to have a sliding scale to allow us to be able to do that. I really appreciated Sierra's work as well. We often consider the differences and the need to add housing and transportation together, and to see the numbers right before us all is fantastic. I think that something that stuck out with me was just that when we think of percent of income, being in multifamily at Freddie Mac, we often are doing a lot of business in major metro areas, and certainly we hear a lot about affordability issues in these gateway markets, the biggest markets that are out there. And you think about the numbers that we saw today, where 30% of income is spent to housing in urban areas. But then when we lay that side by side with the rural areas, and we see that they're spending 30% on transportation, I think that's really important to note. And I think that in this time of inflation, it's really remarkable to think that there's a lot of pressure on both of those things. And while housing might get a lot of attention, we really need to consider them combined, and especially at the rural area where those transportation costs are so high and documented to be. And Andrew, and I think I'll come to you with a question first, but I really appreciate your deep dive into the 515 program. Certainly, reminding us all that we often talk about low-income housing tax credits as the major source of affordable housing in the United States today. But the 515 program has produced so much, and knowing what's causing exits from those, and doing really detailed work into the drivers related to borrower, owner, manager, and local markets is important. And you've really identified issues. I think something that stood out to me was that program. It kind of the years where it was most active was from the mid 1970s to the mid 1990s, and I have to think that these type of properties, and we often think in rural areas of housing stock might be declining in maintenance, or have increasing maintenance needs because of the property condition. And I know that you have loan age, I think, in the analysis. I don't know, like, as you think about what was available to you and what might be drivers of exit and the 515 program, are you able to get anything else on property condition, or what can we know about that?
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I wish we sort of had a magic insight into property conditions. It's not something that's captured in any of the. More broadly, we definitely know that older properties tend to have lower quality. That's kind of just the nature of the world, and subsidized properties in particular often have challenges with reserves. And so financial performance of the properties, is often a source of foreclosure risk and exit for that reason. But even the properties that may remain in the program may still be struggling. And so their ability to upgrade the properties, make renovations, but for additional resources flowing in financing, very difficult. So there are places, there is preservation efforts, both through USDA and then often through adding housing credit funding for these properties is basically the way that preservation tends to happen. But we do not have good data on property conditions. I mean, one way to theoretically get it might be to see whether you've got assessor data, but again, given that 87% of the counties have at least one of these properties, that's a lot of data collection, at least for us. So I think it's an interesting question about property condition, but it's really a challenging data point, but I think a good indicator of overall financial conditions. So there may be other ways to get it. Some of it, it's definitely a concern, and the ability to maintain the habitability of these properties over the long term is definitely a real challenge.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that not just a data challenge for you, but for everybody. I'm positive of that. Sierra, I might come to you with the next question. And I think not only did you split out the cost of transportation and the cost of housing, but you did a really nice analysis which showed just how different areas are in terms of some underlying characteristics where transportation costs are higher than housing costs, and vice versa. And as I think about that, I think about the higher inflation mentioned before. Do you have a special concern, or as the economy weakens and we have inflation, are some households hit especially hard that you can identify in this?
Sure, happy to speak to that. So one of our functions at the Fed is actually to go out into the communities and have conversations with folks about what their on-the-ground experiences are and what economic hardships they're experiencing. And that is actually something that we have been hearing as a common theme as we've visited rural areas, is that the cost of transportation has been a barrier to employment, particularly as the cost of fuel experienced record inflation over the course of the summer. So So I know that that's been a really huge issue that we've been hearing. We have not been hearing a lot about how inflation has been impacting the cost of housing, particularly. However, I will say that a lack of availability of workforce housing is a recurring theme throughout the rural communities that we have been interacting with.
Great points. And now, Sarah, I think I'll come to you with one. And I think the research done by you and the whole team and the research and modeling team here in Freddie Mac Multifamily, started out not particularly focused on rural areas, but certainly because we were able to cover the whole country, it does cover rural areas. As you think about it, as you approached it for this presentation and thought about these topics, how do you think this relates to rural housing?
Thanks, Steve. So yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that we really like to exhibit or show with this type of research that it has the ability to be dynamic and to be adjusted based on what we want to focus on. But I think, first, and we can all agree that housing, affordable housing in rural areas is a very top of mind for all of us to either promote housing there or to help keep housing there, the aging housing stock. So really that's kind of the most important part of the rural areas is the ability to have adequate and available housing, affordable as well. But then, with this methodology and with it being dynamic to be able to focus in on different areas, here we show that we could reset the thresholds. But we can also then focus on different areas that really speak to where maybe you want to focus development or support housing in rural areas. One score looks at multi-generational, so you can kind of either lean heavier on that one. And the other score, the location score, you can also pick out certain areas or certain aspects or factors that drive those scores. So areas that are more economically driven or even less economically driven, but have higher other score components of the scores. So it's a great way to really kind of open up the way we think about finding opportunity in different areas and being able to kind of keep it fluid and have that dynamic ability to really focus in on what we want to, the different factors that are important to all the different localities trying to support housing in rural areas.
Okay. Sounds good. And as I think about, back to you, Andrew, as I think about the 515 program, and again, kind of its major years being between the mid 1970s and mid 1990s, that's quite a while ago, and yet 84% of the properties and units are still in the program. And with the program being tied to the debt, oftentimes we think of the mortgages lasting about 30 years. Are these longer term mortgages? What's keeping these properties in the program?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, currently it's a 30-year mortgage, but historically the loan terms could go out to 50 years, and there were also opportunities to reamortize at various points in time. So part of the legacy of the program is that we have a much longer window of program participation and mortgage length than we typically associate with some of the programs that are available today. So that's a big factor. And the other thing, thinking about the longer term performance of these properties or the affordability of the properties, is that in places where the 515 program has been paired with things like the low-income housing tax credit in states where the affordability requirements under the housing credit program extend well beyond 30 years, the likelihood of remaining affordable, even if there is program exit, will continue to be an important factor in the ongoing affordability and viability of those properties.
Thanks, Andrew. And as you mentioned, the 515 program and the low-income housing tax program, there's obviously explicit programs supporting housing, and they do so at the rural area and beyond. Makes me think, Sara, that you've established transportation as just as important in terms of a cost. And I'm wondering, are there programs that are comparable that are supporting people in transportation costs?
So that's a great question. And the answer is that they're very idiosyncratic to place. So a lot of them are primarily focused on persons with disabilities and seniors, and making sure that they have a way to get from their homes to the places that they need to go. But again, it's really dependent on what programs the local government is able to provide, and what resources they have available. I don't know any large scale programs, I will say, that really address transportation costs. I know that one big issue that we've been hearing when we've been talking to communities throughout the 5th District has been that a number of states will have driver's licenses taken away as a punitive measure. And in places that have limited transportation options other than a personal vehicle, having the lack of an ability to use your car legally is a really big challenge. And so I think that that's a really big policy opportunity to kind of revisit some of those policies, and actually make sure that folks who rely on a car to get from one place to another have reliable transportation in that way. But I think that it's a really big area of need is the need for policies and programs that are serving populations that have high transportation costs. And I look forward to innovation in the space in the future.
Certainly, and I think your research hopefully points people in that direction. Thank you, and again, thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to Sara, to you, Sierra, and to Andrew, and thanks to everybody for hanging on with us here. And now I will turn it back to Danny Gardner. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you for your insights. In fact, I'd like to thank all of our speakers and guests, especially our keynote speaker, Professor Catherine Eden of Princeton University. I'm looking forward to her new book, The Injustice of Place, Uncovering the Legacy of Poverty in America. The sessions will be available to you for up to 1 year in the platform, so please come back and reference them and share them with your colleagues. We also hope that you'll let us know how we did by completing the post-event survey. We hope that you all found this gathering invaluable, and we look forward to seeing you all at next year's symposium. Thank you.